Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 154 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Fia, and that is Gavin. And,
Hello.
Yeah, hi, Gavin.
Hi. We've had some tech difficulties this evening so far, which is unfortunate. Thankfully, I don't think it should impact the actual recording at all. It was mostly just my computer misbehaving as I was trying to do some last-minute prep. So recording a little over an hour after we meant to.
But that's okay.
But,
we'll get it done.
Ain't that just the way? But yeah, we're here. Mike is not.
Yeah.
Because of just a quirk of our schedules. We're recording on a different day than we typically do. And we kind of figured, well, Mike, on sometimes when it's just two of the three of us, it is often just Mike and I. So we figured, hey, let's have it just be Fia and I today.
Yeah.
So we're going to be having a good time talking about the Miocene Epoch. That is one of my favorite personal points in geologic time.
Cool.
This is the time that my master's thesis was sort of set in.
Mm-hmm.
The fossil site was basically right in the middle of the Miocene. A little bit toward the end from the middle, but close enough. So this is, Mike sometimes calls me an expert on the podcast. I hesitate to ever actually call myself that.
Yeah.
But of the episodes for which that is appropriate, this one is probably the most appropriate. I don't have a PhD or anything in it, but this is what the time that my master's thesis was set in. So I'm really excited about it. I've spent a lot of time looking at fossils from this time period.
Yeah.
And I'm excited for it.
Me too.
But yeah, so with that, we'll do some housekeeping, and then we will give another little science update on what the government is doing, unfortunately. Then we'll do some Seagrass Corner, and then we'll get into the episode because we don't have a Today in History.
Sounds good.
So yeah, Sophia, do you want to keep house?
Sure. As always, don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube to give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the pod. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, please be sure to fill out the guest form, and all that stuff can be found in the show notes. And Gavin, what's next episode topic?
I don't know. It's not mine.
You're right.
Fia, what are we doing next episode?
I felt silly if I had asked myself. It's going to be a surprise because I had an idea and then I forgot to write down that idea. So I'm thinking maybe we'll do...
I've been there.
Yeah, maybe.
Been there too many times to count.
Maybe we'll do stable isotopes and food webs or underwater sound because those are two kind of fun things I'm working on right now.
That sounds cool. Underwater sound is just always something that's super interesting. So I know that's a part of your research that anytime you bring it up, you haven't talked about it a lot, but anytime you bring it up, it's always really neat.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll lean
But also
in
stable
that.
isotopes are also pretty cool.
Yeah. I recently, well, actually, as of next week, I'm starting to put out acoustic recorders for my third chapter of my dissertation, and so that is very quickly coming up, and I am not prepared. But it's okay.
You're going to be great.
Yeah,
it's going to be fine.
It will be.
You got this.
But yeah, do you want to do Seagrass Corner first?
Yeah, sure. I just figured that we'd trade, but you know what? We'll go Seagrass Corner, and then we'll go Sadness.
Okay. So, for Seeker's Corner, I wanted to talk about the pinfish, Legodon rhomboides. This is a bait fish common in the Florida coastal waters. They're silvery with blue and yellow stripes and then yellow fins. They usually have a large dark spot behind their gill cover. Usually they are less than 8 inches, again, very small bait fish.
Okay.
And they like to live in the coastal waters near structure or cover, so any sort of thing with some relief of some kind, like seagrass. Um, Something cool I found out when looking into this species is the genus Lagodon combines lagus, meaning hair or rabbit, with odon, meaning tooth. And this is thought to be because of their incisor-like teeth that are kind of like like sheep's head, like the teeth that kind of like look like
I hate
human
that.
teeth.
I
But
hate that so much.
they're not as drastic as that. It's more of like almost like a comb shit instead, like just kind of like one piece with a bunch of
Okay.
like zigzags on the bottom. But yeah,
Hmm.
so maybe rabbit teeth is what they were going for with that. And then rhomboides means in the form of a rhombus, and that's presumed to be like reference to the shape of their scales. So cool fun fact about those guys.
Hmm.
And pretty much they're I would say the most abundant fish that I see when going out. So it's just kind of like, seeing I don't know, like a robin or something. No, something more common, like a seagull at the grocery store parking lots. Does that happen in the north? Do you see
What?
like trash
No.
birds?
Okay. Yeah, I guess. Especially up where I grew up.
Yeah,
Uh, around the Great Lakes and,
yeah.
major bodies of water. Yeah, I guess. But never, they don't usually bring fish.
No, 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 no. This was just like a comparison of like how abundant they are. Like
Gotcha. Okay.
they're kind of like that abundance. Like they're just very common. And
That makes sense.
yeah, so they are pretty common, and thus they're prey for a lot of species like gar, sea trout, red drum, all of the good fun things that people like to fish for.
Neat.
Yeah. And with that, Gavin, tell us some things that are happening today.
Sadness. So the main thing that I want to mention here, and they're like the last time, there will be a timestamp if you want to skip the sadness down in the show notes. So one of the things that has been most angering to me personally is something that is very low on most other people's list of priorities, and I acknowledge that. And that is all the stuff that the government, the administration has been doing about foreign aid. And this relates to science in a number of ways. Mostly in terms of healthcare and medicine. So I am a longtime watcher, viewer, listener of the Green brothers, Hank Green and John Green.
Oh, yes, me too.
And John Green has a book coming out. He's a very famous novelist.
Right?
Yes.
Cool.
Most of his books are novels. They are, fiction. So he wrote The Fault in Our Stars. He recently had a movie come out.
Turtles All the Way Down.
Turtles All the Way Down.
Yeah.
Yeah. So most of his books are novels. And so exactly 2 weeks from today, so the day before next episode comes out, if we do things according to plan, John Green has a book coming out about tuberculosis.
Yeah.
For anyone not aware, which growing up, I had never really heard about it. It was mostly just something that I heard in like when they talk really fast at the end of like drug commercials. You know how they list the various like precautions or things to like, don't take this if you have somewhere in that they say tuberculosis.
Yeah.
That was pretty much the only context that I knew about tuberculosis, because I'm a very fortunate person in my life in that I live in a developed country with readily available healthcare. Tuberculosis is the deadliest disease in humans of all time. Over the course of human history, it has killed literally billions of people.
Yeah.
And every year, think of any other disease. Any of it. Tuberculosis kills more people per year than pretty much all of those combined. And tuberculosis is the number one killer of people. And it has been every year, with 2 exceptions in a long time. And that was 2020 and 2021, in which it was COVID.
Yep.
And so, because John, in his YouTube videos, he and Hank each put out one a week on sort of a shared YouTube channel. There'll be a link to his most recent video at the time of recording down in the show notes. So he basically reads the first chapter of his book about tuberculosis and why he cares so much about it.
Yeah.
And how this sort of wraps into foreign aid and science is because tuberculosis is difficult to cure, but it is very curable.
Yep.
You need to take, a steady dose of drugs for sometimes weeks to months, but it is very curable.
Right.
And the United States government has been, before USAID, the main, foreign aid arm of the federal government, was created in, I think, 2000. Before that, we had been helping treat tuberculosis for years. But especially now that there was this sort of single entity helping from the federal government, we've been helping a lot of people. And in fact, there are some numbers from USAID. So it's since 2000, the United States government has basically saved the lives of about 58 million people.
Wow.
Around the world from tuberculosis.
Yep.
That's more than 2 million people a year.
Mm-hmm.
And that's awesome.
That is awesome.
That's a great thing that we've done. And now that is no longer happening.
Because
the government has decided to stop that funding. And there are hundreds to thousands of doses of this medicine already in these places, in places like Africa and Southeast Asia, where people had been getting treated by our government, that those doses of medicine that will save their lives is just sitting behind a door that those people can no longer access because Elon Musk told them, no, sorry, you're going to die.
Yep.
And that's what's going to happen to these people without this medicine. And not only that, tuberculosis is incredibly infectious. And Fia, you're a biologist. What happens when someone stops a course of, for example, antibiotics before they're done?
They can probably get that infection back again in full force.
Not just that, but the ones that medicine has not yet killed are
they become
now
resistant.
They have a higher chance of becoming resistant to that medicine. So we have basically just created hundreds or thousands of strains of drug-resistant tuberculosis, which is so much harder to cure and is definitely going to directly, because of this decision, kill millions of people over the course of time.
Yep.
That is not an exaggeration. This single decision is going to kill millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also the case for various other diseases and illnesses that have been being treated through USAID. And I don't know about you, but that sounds like a recipe for another pandemic.
Yep. Yeah, it sure does.
Tuberculosis is not as infectious, as easily spread as something like flu, thankfully. But yeah, so this is very, very worrying. And so, like I said, please, if you have, I think 5 minutes or so is how long that video from from John Green is. Please go listen to it, because it's just him reading the first chapter of his book, and it was something that was really important to me, something that I didn't really even know about until John started talking about it a lot on YouTube in the past couple of years.
Does he mention like any petitions to sign or anything that like we could do?
No, I don't think he does.
Okay.
Mostly because, frankly, what can you do?
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
Unless you're in a position to somehow file a lawsuit, which I don't have that kind of money.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think just more people talking about it and talking earnestly about, hey, not only is this going to kill lots of people, which just on its face is bad, we shouldn't want to do that.
Yeah.
But also something just from a purely selfish, national interest of the country aspect. There are countries who are our, strategic adversaries in the world, like China,
Mm-hmm.
who have access to this medicine and are going to swoop in our absence and help these people, hopefully. And I hope they do that. I really do.
Yeah.
But all these people whose lives were being saved by the United States just got told, I hate you, go die.
Yeah.
And then China swoops in and says, I am going to save you. So all these people in these countries are now going to hate the United States and like China. And I don't blame them.
I don't blame them either, but I just don't want them to hate me.
And I feel like most people can make that distinction. But at the same time, it's like, the heads of state in these various places, if it came down to making a deal with the United States, in 5 or 10 years, say it's a different administration, 5 to 10 years, say Kenya discovers some reserve of, critical minerals within its borders. Who are they going to make a deal with?
Yep.
After we've told a decent chunk of their population, we hate you, go die.
Yeah.
Not us. So, just purely selfishly, from a strategic standpoint, this is terrible. Let alone the actual human life cost. So anyway, that is the one thing that I kind of wanted to single out here.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, but before next episode comes out, Everything is Tuberculosis. Everything is Tuberculosis will be out by John Green. I'm gonna buy a copy, and like I said, there'll be a link to that YouTube video down in the show notes. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gavin.
Anywho, yeah, thanks isn't the the word I would use. That just makes me feel sad. But anyway, welcome back to any folks who decided to skip the sadness. We're going to be talking about the Miocene Epoch. Yeah, so like I said at the top of the episode, the Miocene is one of my personal favorite times in Earth history because it's really familiar to the world we have today, but different enough to be just kind of unsettling. Not weird like all the alien animals in the Cambrian period,
mm-hmm.
Way back when complex multicellular life was still sort of figuring itself out and had lots of weird experiments going on that didn't end up working.
Yeah.
See episode 50 for the Cambrian period.
Great plug.
But no. Yes, thank you. The Miocene is weird because while yes, there were some groups of animals that are completely extinct today that would look weird, and we'll talk about those in time, but especially here in North America, most of the animals would look very familiar. You'd be able to tell what kind of animal it is, but it would seem very out of place because they don't live here today.
Okay.
And so we'll talk more about those when we get to the animals sort of section of the episode. But as always, when we do these different episodes about different chunks of Earth's history, before we talk about the critters, we got to talk about what the world was up to globally at the time.
Let's do it.
So, the Miocene lasted from 23.03 to 5.333 million years ago. That is how precise we can get with dates at this point, because this is relatively recent. Even a little over 20 million years ago is, all things considered, quite recent in Earth's history. We can get down to a few tens of thousands of years with a pretty reasonable degree of confidence.
Cool.
So like I said, all things considered, this is pretty recent, and because of that, things like the continents were more or less where they are today. A little bit of a notable exception is South America, at least at the beginning. South America was sort of marching northward, and by the end of the Miocene was almost connected to North America, but not quite. What is now most of Central America, especially like southern Central America and what is today Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama.
Mm-hmm.
Those were sort of a chain of islands that a handful of species were kind of able to island hop to get from one continent to the other. We'll talk about those a little bit later. For the most part, it was sloths. Sloths are surprisingly good swimmers. And so some sloths made it into North America just barely at the very, very end of the Miocene.
Nice.
Australia was also still moving around a lot. And it had kind of moved into a drier band of latitude. For context, where it is now is roughly at the same latitude as like southern Africa and parts of South America, which are all like very, very dry places, mostly due to just quirks of how the prevailing winds blow at those latitudes. So if you look at like a global map, at either 30 degrees north or south latitude, it's just very dry all over the world.
Okay.
Yeah, that is where like the Sahara Desert and the Arabian Peninsula are. That's where like Mexico and like southern North America are in that 30-degree sort of area, as well as these places, Australia, southern Africa and southern South America. Just the quirk of the way the wind currents blow, those areas are just very dry. And so it was during this time that Australia fully sort of cemented itself in that sort of dry band.
Okay.
Overall, though, around the world, the climate was cooling. Global temperatures were coming down. This was pre-Ice Age, so we were sort of marching toward what we would call the Ice Age. And the global temperatures had been cooling since like the late Eocene, so about 30 million years ago, about 10 million years before the start of the Miocene. That's kind of when Antarctica started growing permanent ice, which sort of makes a feedback loop and cools the planet even more. You can see episode 131 for more on the Eocene and Antarctica. Another one of the quirks of climate is that, generally speaking, colder air holds less moisture. As someone who has lived in pretty cold places for most of my life, I can definitely attest to this.
I agree. My skin...
Winter air is, it is very, very dry compared to summer air. But that quirk also applies just globally. As temperatures fell, that means that in general, the world's climate also became drier. And in addition to Antarctica growing more ice, which lowered global temperatures, there was a lot of mountain building going on in the world. As we've talked about a number of times throughout the history of this show, when there's a lot of mountain building going on, that also can lower global temperatures. So, for example, the Himalayas had been growing for a while and were still on the rise. They're still technically rising today as well. But, this was the case then too. In the Miocene, they had some new friends that were kind of cropping up in different places around the world. The southern portions of the Andes Mountains in South America was uplifted at this time. The northern half had sort of been there for a while. And then a lot of like comparatively shorter mountains sort of all around the Mediterranean were growing. This time in the Mediterranean, I'm not going to talk about it a little later. So this is a good place to mention. It's not really in my notes. This part's just kind of off the dome.
Okay.
This is when Africa and Eurasia became more connected. And so Africa was continuing to move north. It had been sort of like loosely connected to Eurasia for a little while, but here's when it fully becomes connected.
Gotcha.
And because of that, there was some funky stuff going on with the Mediterranean. One thing that I think is worth mentioning, even though I'm not going to go into it much, is this time called the Messinian Salinity Crisis. Basically, the Mediterranean was for a time completely sealed off from the ocean. But that's a very hot part of the world.
Yeah.
And so the Mediterranean got super, super salty. And because of that, there's a lot of weird geology things going on with the Mediterranean at this time. But because we have continents moving into each other, there's a lot of just like shorter mountains that kind of crop up all around the Mediterranean in places like Turkey, northwestern Africa, Spain, Greece, etc.
Okay.
And basically, as this sort of happens, certain types of silicate minerals that are formed in these sort of mountain building times, when they sort of weather and erode just being exposed to air, as part of like that chemical reaction, they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere as part of that, breakdown process. And so mountain building just makes and then exposes a lot of those silicate minerals. And so more mountains equals less CO2, which then equals lower global temperatures.
Okay.
This sort of cooling and drying trend had been happening for a while at this point, and it definitely continued through the Miocene, reaching a very interesting sort of critical mass when it came to the plant life on Earth.
Why is that?
So let's talk about plants. Disclaimer here. As we've brought up many times on the show, I don't particularly like plants. They just
They don't like you either, Gavin.
That is correct. They just function like so fundamentally differently from animals on so many levels that they kind of scare me. That said, there is one group of plants that I am a little partial to, and that's grasses.
Yeah, me too.
We spent a whole episode talking about grasses, episode 102. And that is literally just one of 2 episodes out of 154 where the main topic was plants.
I feel like
the other episode was episode... What was that?
I feel like there's been 3.
Well, sort of. The other episode was 71, which was just sort of like an overview, introduction to plants in general, how they work, and why I don't like them. We've had some plant-heavy episodes. The one I was thinking of when you said that was the swamps episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like that was very plant-heavy. But like, we have a bunch of episodes about different groups of animals, their taxonomy, what they do in their environment, stuff like that, their evolution.
Yeah.
We have one of those for plants in general.
Okay.
And then one of those for grasses, and that's it. And so the fact that grasses are the only group of plants that we've talked about specifically with their own episode should tell you that, at least to me, they're pretty important. And so the Miocene is when grasses really start to sort of assert the dominance that they have today. And you might be thinking, how are grasses dominant when environments like forests exist? I grew up in a pretty forested part of the world, all things considered. Growing up in northern New York, there's a lot of, big forest. And so that was my sort of first thought too. Most people kind of think of grass as the stuff that grows in your lawn, that you have to cut every so often, more of a chore than like an environmental force.
Right.
However, grasses are dominant in the same way that ants are dominant.
Right.
Let me explain. First, there are so many of them. But not just species, like individuals.
Yep.
For reference, there's about 8 billion people in the world, billion with a B. For every 1 person on Earth, there's about 2.5 million ants.
That's a lot of ants.
For a total of about 20 quadrillion ants in the world.
Yeah.
In that same vein, in a 1-acre lawn, and I grew up pretty rural area. The plot of land that my parents owned that I grew up on was almost exactly an acre. There are about 35 million individual grass plants.
Seems about right.
By that math, there are trillions of individual grass plants in the world.
Yeah.
And because of that, they do an extraordinarily large part in their environments. They are the environment, really, especially because they are primary producers. They are the thing that brings energy into their ecosystem to then be made available for everything else.
You're speaking my language, Gavin.
That's right, little ecology going on.
Yeah.
That being said, also I said a little bit ago that not just because they're diverse, but they're a very diverse group of plants. There's about 12,000 species or so. It's very hard to actually count plant species, especially because they will hybridize across species that are not all that closely related.
Yep.
That's one of the things that I hate about them. And just for context, 12,000 is about twice the number of mammal species. And grasses are not even the most diverse group of plants. And so grasses include plants like, yes, the typical grass that makes up your lawn, but also many, many different types of crops like wheat, corn, rice, barley, also bamboo, which is why you can sort of cut bamboo and it will regrow like your lawn does. Whereas when you cut down a tree, it dies.
Yeah.
The fact that we don't use bamboo for more stuff
is
kind of silly to me. I did actually, when I was writing the notes for this, I was like, why don't we use bamboo for everything we use wood for? And there are reasons. But we could use it for a lot more stuff. I digress. Grasses have been around for a surprisingly long time, considering we're kind of just talking about them during the Miocene, which is fairly recent. They've been around since the middle of the Cretaceous period. So about 105 million years ago, or about 80 million years before the start of the Miocene. However, it wasn't until the Miocene when most of them sort of developed one of their... It's not quite like a signature feature, but they are sort of the poster child for this feature, which is the specific way that they do photosynthesis.
Is this like getting into C4 and C3?
Exactly.
Okay.
So I'm not going to bore you listeners with the exact details of photosynthesis. It is the like sort of default way is not all that complicated. The other ways are somewhat complicated, but broadly there are 3 different ways to do it. C3 is the sort of default way to do photosynthesis. This is the one you learn about in high school. Plants absorb CO2 through little pores on their leaves, and they absorb water through their roots, and then they use energy gained from sunlight to combine those, producing sugar and oxygen.
Yeah.
If it gets too hot or too dry for them, they close those pores on the leaves to conserve water, but that means that they can't absorb more CO2, so photosynthesis stops for them. Most plants do this kind of photosynthesis. So that was C3. C4 plants mostly do the same thing, but they put a couple of extra steps in the way when they take in CO2. So very oversimplified. They move the molecules into sort of different chambers to do the different steps. Overall, this makes it a bit more complicated and can be less efficient to do it this way, but this method helps reduce the amount of water that they lose when they have their pores open. This means that they can handle drier and hotter climates and still be able to efficiently do photosynthesis without drying out.
Yeah.
This is what grasses and a couple of other types of plants do. This is not like it evolved one time and then just this group do it. No, it evolved like a bunch of times. So like there's a couple trees that do it.
I think mangroves do it.
That would make sense, given how salty all the water around them is. That makes sense. But this is very much the minority. It is just a small handful of types of plants do this. And then there's the weird one that is called CAM photosynthesis, C-A-M.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very, very much the minority of plants. They live in the driest environment, and it is so dry in those places that they can't have their pores open at all during the day. So instead, they collect all the CO2 they need and release all their oxygen at night when it's cooler, and they can have their pores open without dying. And then during the day, they seal themselves up and use the CO2 that they absorbed overnight to do photosynthesis.
So I'm assuming this is probably things like cactuses or something?
Yes. Cool. Yep. So this is what cacti and succulents do. They basically hold their breath all day and do all their breathing for the day at night.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's very cool. But it is very inefficient if you don't need to do it that way.
Right.
That's why, in some cases, things like pineapples, for example, do this. They're a fairly tropical plant. So that one is mostly a case of my ancestors did it, so I kind of have to now. But yes, for the most part, that is just extreme dry weather plants. And so the reason why grasses really pop off in the Miocene is that, by all accounts, this is when grasses evolve this method of photosynthesis that is really good at conserving water. Not the extreme cactus one, but the C4 version that is a few more steps, but it helps them save water.
Cool.
And wouldn't you know it, at this time in Earth's history, saving water is a pretty good thing to do.
Why is that?
Well, the world was drying, as we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And so my next bullet just says, forests are made up of trees. Thanks, Gavin. So trees are almost exclusively C3 plants, meaning that they aren't great at dealing with drier climates. And as the global climate dried in the Oligocene, so the previous epoch, and then into the Miocene, those forests kind of dispersed. You couldn't have trees as densely packed because now they were all extra competing for water. And in between those trees that were now spreading out, grasses took over, and they took the place of what used to be forest because they now had the tools to deal with this new dry climate.
Yep. Cool. And
so all this might sound kind of boring.
Oh,
but
I found it really cool.
Think about how... Yeah, well... but think about how different the environment of a place with trees is compared to, say, the savannas of East Africa or the Great Plains. If you've ever driven across Kansas, you can easily tell where there's a stream or something because that's the only place that you can see around with trees.
Yeah.
And so plants are really what make these environments different. We don't talk about plants enough on this show, and it's mostly because I'm scared.
That's okay.
But yeah, so this is really, like, other things were happening with other groups of plants, I'm sure. But if you look up anything about plants in the Miocene, it's all grass. It is grass all the way down. And so naturally, when the environment changes because of these plants changing from forests to open grasslands, the animals kind of have to be shaken up as well in order to keep up. And so, Fia, if you will scroll down in the notes, I will highlight a big section. You can find that section. Because I will have you open up some links and help me describe what some of these animals look like.
Okay.
Yeah, so there were definitely some groups of animals that were around at this time that we don't have any relatives of today. For example, some of these animals are animals like entelodonts. We talked about these a little bit in our pigs episode 151.
Yeah, I feel like I
They were,
recognize these guys.
yeah, they're very popular because they're very interesting. So they're even-toed ungulates. So these are things that are related to pigs, cows, deer, goats, etc. And you can help me describe them a little bit. They're sort of like big pigs on stilts.
Yeah, I would say like they almost kind of they look almost like Pumbaa mixed with a hyena.
Okay, yeah, I see how you can get that.
Yeah, like just a little bit of like in the back hyena like, but mostly very pig-like.
Yeah.
But big.
And so they're often called hell pigs or terminator pigs.
Yeah.
Despite not being really that closely related to pigs. They're more closely related to things like hippos and whales than they are to anything else we have today, but they don't have any like descendants around today.
Interesting.
Yeah, they could range in size from like relatively small, like basically pig sized, up to like almost cow sized. Some of them got quite large. And they were a bit more carnivorous than pigs tend to be, but they were still mostly omnivores, eating kind of whatever they found. These go extinct by the middle Miocene, though, so they don't make it to the end.
Okay.
Next, we have the Oreodonts, a very famous group of another group of even-toed ungulates. So again, related to cows, sheep, camels are also in this group. These ones were a bit less intense, though. I always kind of struggle to describe these to people because they're just so like nondescript.
Yeah.
They sort of look like bulky pigs or sheep, but with like long tails.
Yeah. It's like they kind of almost look like big rat-like, but with some mammal features.
Yeah, it is just kind of a mishmash of like general or generic animal, like dollar store mammal.
Dollar store mammal. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it doesn't help that there's also not a lot of like recent like good paleo art of them.
Yeah.
So like for example, most of the stuff you'll see if you look them up is like almost like cartoon style. There's no like good like 3D renders of them, despite them being like very diverse and like they were around for a really long time. They're not like a fringe group at all. We just don't happen to not have them today. Yeah, despite being ungulates, they had feet kind of more like camels, where they don't have hooves per se like pigs or sheep do. More like foot pads, and then they had like little hooves that like cap off each toe. Very, very common at this time, and in North America at least functioned a lot like deer, since deer weren't in the Americas yet.
Yeah.
These guys made it to the end of the Miocene and then went extinct. Like I said, they were around for a very long time, very successful, diverse group of animals. We just happen to not have them today. Now for some carnivores. Weird group that like sure look a heck of a lot like cats.
Yeah.
And honestly, maybe they were cats. We'll talk about it in a sec. But this is a group called the Barbarophilids. Again, they just kind of look like slightly wrong cats. They're quite closely related to cats, so it's not really a surprise. They often had like saber teeth.
Yeah.
Like the very famous like Smilodon saber-toothed cat from the Ice Age.
I was gonna say that's what these look like to me from my perspective.
Yeah, and so here's my next bullet. Just says a bit of pedantry. This group of animals has kind of been bounced around a lot, whether they're their own family, whether they belong within actual cats, which is the family Felidae, whether they belong in a different group of also very cat-like saber-toothed carnivores called the Nimravids. Again, super cat-like, but these ones for sure are not cats. They are different. And I only bring this up because Nimravids were extinct by the Miocene. Except if this group, the Barbarophilids, are Nimravids, then they make it to the Miocene. Taxonomy is confusing, but I like taxonomy.
Yeah.
Either way, doesn't matter. This group went extinct by the end of the Miocene, likely from competition from true cats, the family Felidae.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we have the Amphicyonids. This is a group that's sort of colloquially called bear dogs, despite probably not being particularly close to either bears or dogs. They're on the dog side of the carnivore family tree.
Mm-hmm.
They might be like their closest relative today is probably bears,
Yeah.
but it's not like they were sisters.
Yeah.
And so they were very, very widespread all across Eurasia, Africa, and North America. And they kind of look like just like a really heavily built cat, like a tiger, but with like the long snout of a dog.
Yeah, they kind of have like a badger face.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. But yeah, wherever these guys were, they, as with everything in paleontology, most people kind of focus on like the largest member of a group. I was fortunate in that one of the larger members of this group was one that I had at my site that I worked on for my master's thesis. Some of them could get quite large, like, brown bear sized or potentially a little bigger. Most of them, though, obviously were a bit smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And they could get, as small as like medium dog or so.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess they do kind of look more dog-like.
Yeah, and it's... I that's why I kind of hate... I get why we do it as science communicators, but I hate when we give things common names like this, because we call these bear dogs.
Mm. There
is a type of canid, so an actual dog, mm-hmm. that is around today that is called a dog bear. There are a ton of different scientific names for different groups of animals where in different languages it translates to some combination of dog bear or bear dog. Mm-hmm. It's very annoying, but yeah. Anyway, these were the main predators in their environment most of the time. And for a long time. These guys were around for a while as well, but they went extinct by the end of the Miocene as well. Sensing a theme here.
Yeah.
And then lastly, for the sort of animals that, we no longer have, a group of called hyenodonts. This was a very, very old group of carnivorous mammals that branched off really early on in like placental mammal evolution. So like they're not like, monotremes like the platypus off laying eggs or anything. But they are completely outside all of our modern carnivore groups. So they're not really related to cats. They're not related to dogs. They are kind of off to the left on their own. They also kind of looked like bulky cats with giant heads.
Yeah.
Some of the larger members could be as big as like a polar bear. These got to be quite large. But some of the smaller ones obviously were a bit more lightly built. Yeah, how would you describe some of these guys?
Yeah, they just kind of look like they have a disproportionately big head.
Yeah.
But yeah, kind of like generic mammal with maybe more of like top heavy, I guess.
Yeah, and that's kind of the gist with a lot of these groups that didn't really make it out of the Miocene, is that they are very bulky. Mm-hmm. Like they're very top heavy. They're not very agile. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that we'll talk about in a little bit.
Cool.
But yeah, just like the Amphicyonids, these guys were sort of all across Eurasia, Africa, and North America. But they went extinct by the end of the Miocene as well. And I'm sure there were tons of other groups that I'm forgetting. These are just some of the ones that I wanted to highlight. Mm-hmm. That were major players at this time, but didn't make it or have any descendants that we have today.
Cool.
And so all of those that I've mentioned so far are from the well-connected continents of North America, Africa, and Eurasia. They all had been exchanging animals for quite a while at this point. Mm-hmm. But South America and Australia were still off by themselves. So what were they doing? Australia, as per usual, were doing a lot of weird marsupial things. Kangaroos, koalas, possums, not opossums, but possums.
Right.
They are different.
Opossums are here.
And wombats. Yes, opossums are... there are some opossums down in South America as well. But,
Mm-hmm.
the kind, if you live in North America, the kind that you've seen in your trash, that is an opossum.
Mm-hmm. Anyway.
But yeah, so all the typical marsupials that you think of with Australia, they were around. Some of them pretty recently, like kangaroos, like just sort of started looking like kangaroos during the Miocene. There are also some marsupial predators that we don't really have any of today in Australia. Things like the relatives of like the thylacine, which is the Tasmanian tiger, the one that's very, very recently extinct, like 200 years ago or less.
Mm-hmm.
There's a species called Thylacaleo that was about as large as a lion. That had some really jacked up teeth, but was a very prominent ambush predator in Australia. Australia also had a lot of weird birds, including some really large predatory birds that are kind of like related to eagles. They also had some herbivorous giant flightless birds related to ducks. They got over, 6 or 7 feet tall. Some of them, depending on the species, got even close to like 10 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know me, a 10-foot tall goose is my literal worst nightmare. So congrats, Australia. You got me. My wife is very afraid of snakes, and she says we will never go to Australia. But this would keep me from going there if this lived there.
Yeah. I
hate geese.
Andy and I are actually thinking of going to Australia for our honeymoon.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Like, I want to go so bad.
Yeah.
It's also so expensive.
Oh, true. Yeah.
They also had most of the typical reptiles you think of in Australia, like crocodiles, monitor lizards, even a weird group of terrestrial turtles that had like clubbed tails was running around in Australia at this time. However, we'll get to snakes in a minute, because I want to talk about snakes. We'll get there in a sec. Moving on to South America. South America had way weirder stuff going on, and I think it's way weirder, mostly because we don't have anything remaining of it today. At least Australia, we still have kangaroos and koalas and wombats and stuff. The stuff going on in Australia was just crazy because there's not a lot of it left. They had their own version of basically everything we've talked about, but almost entirely unrelated to anything we have today. For example, like giant flightless birds were some of the main predators. Like 6-7 foot tall birds. Alongside some fairly large marsupial predators and a group of fully terrestrial crocodilians.
Oh, God.
That could run.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. Real bonkers stuff. The main large herbivores were mostly belonging to one of two groups. The group that contains like sloths and armadillos. They had like, giant, not quite to like the giant ground sloths that we see during the Ice Age. But still fairly large, like cow-sized sloths. As well as armadillos with giant armored shells and stuff. So that was one group. Or the other group is a group of ungulates totally unrelated to anything we have today. We don't really have time to get into their weirdness, but despite being totally unrelated, they had eerily similar versions of everything from camels to rhinos to horses to deer to hippos, even small herbivores like rabbits and more on the rodent side. All of those belong to the same group of ungulates, but they were just incredibly disparate in their habitat. So there's diversity, which is like just, count how many species there are. And then there's disparity, which is how different from each other those species are. And this group was incredibly disparate, from rhinos and hippos size things down to rabbits, basically. Very weird group of animals.
Wow.
At some point, we will have a whole episode about these guys at some point. Unfortunately, they're not as well researched as a lot of other groups of mammals, just because research in South America has been funded for, not as long as research in North America has been. And also a lot of places in South America are just hard to get to. You're not pulling a lot of fossils out of the Amazon. So, so there's a number of reasons why these are a bit less studied, but there's still so much cool stuff to learn about these guys. But until we get to that, we have a little bit of an episode where I talk about these guys just sort of in context, and way back in episode 16, where we talked about the Great American Biotic Interchange. When North and South America finally connected and started sharing all their animals. Okay, so all that out of the way. That's all the stuff that we don't have anymore, except for some of those marsupials. Let's talk about the animals that we do have today.
What do we got?
I like talking about the Miocene, like I said at the beginning, because by and large, many animals that were around look fairly similar, or would look fairly familiar to us, but they would just seem out of place, especially here in North America. North America, especially in the center of the continent, like the Great Plains, would have looked very, very similar to what is today the African Serengeti. There were many species of horses running around, which are often depicted as having stripes, not fully striped like a zebra, but, in that same vein. They also ranged in size from maybe a little smaller than sort of a domesticated horse down to like the size of a sheep or a bit smaller. So you had big horses to tiny horses. We had rhinos here in North America. There were camels that were nearly as big as giraffes.
Wow.
But also camels that were about 3 feet tall and more gazelle-like. There were tapirs. Which, if you're not familiar, they're related to rhinos and horses. They're like the little thing that looks like a pig, but with a little trunk at the end of its snout.
Yep.
That's a tapir. We had those here. Don't live here now. Elephant relatives, and lots of animals that are now iconic where they live today, but they were all in North America.
Wow.
And in the case of the horses, rhinos, tapirs, and camels, they all originated here. This is where they evolved for the first time, and then spread out across the rest of the world, only to become extinct here, where they started.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so you would definitely be able to look at that and be like, oh, that's a horse, that's a rhino, that's a big camel. But it would just look weird because it's like, I know that I'm in Nebraska. Why is there a rhino here?
Right.
Elsewhere, in like Africa and Eurasia, this was also sort of the case, mostly because for most of the Miocene, they were missing the groups that we just talked about that were here living in North America. Camels, for example, didn't cross over into Eurasia until the very end of the Miocene, so, camels were not running around in Egypt or the Arabian Peninsula at this point. Rhinos had been in Eurasia for a little while, but they didn't get to Africa until the middle of the Miocene. Horses didn't get to the Old World until well after the Miocene, so there were no zebras in Africa yet. And like I said, there were some animals that are kind of quote unquote where they belong today, but they were just kind of different. For example, elephants at the time were weird compared to today. The ones today would look kind of tame, honestly, because they're big, but these ones had like extra tusks and were just doing weird stuff with their trunk. One of the main groups at this time were called gomphotheres. They were a bit smaller than today's elephants, but still pretty big. It's an elephant. And in addition to having tusks on the upper jaw, like, modern elephants do, many of them had tusks on the bottom jaw too. Basically just like a long chin made out of tusk. There was also a species of elephant in Africa called Dinotherium, which didn't have tusks on the upper jaw at all. But it had tusks on the lower jaws that curved backward toward the front legs, almost kind of like a beard or a goatee. And I will highlight that. I didn't put a link in here, but if you want to look at that, Fia, because that's a weird one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's just weird.
It's just weird because it's tusk, so it's like an elephant, but with its tusks like flipped upside down.
Yeah, pretty much. And so it's like, yep, that sure is an elephant, but it just looks wrong.
Yeah, it looks very wrong. It looks like it's trying to be a beaver.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't think, like, obviously people have hypotheses. I don't think we're super sure what it was doing with those, because it's hard to use those for digging when you're that tall, because this was a fairly large one, too. This was pretty close to the size of, modern African elephants.
Yeah.
So it's like, you're not getting down on your knees to use that to dig up stuff, like elephants today sometimes use their tusks for.
I could see why
you're probably not using that to fight with.
Yeah. I could see why they went extinct.
It could be. There was also some others that, like I said, with the tusks on the bottom jaw, where they were kind of like spoon-shaped.
Whoa.
So they weren't just like cones, they were like concave, like spoons. Very strange. So elephants today look relatively simple compared to their ancestors. Again, sort of just a group that you can tell what it is, but it just looks kind of strange. The main group of dogs at this time were much more stocky than the typical wolf is today. They weren't very good at sort of the long-range chasing that we associate with wolves and other dogs today. Instead, they were much more ambush hunters, who kind of had to surprise their prey and catch it quickly rather than wearing it down over time. And a lot of the reason for things just being sort of weird or in a weird place relative to today was because the global environment was shifting to this grass-dominated ecosystems that we have today. And while the plants were sort of mid-change, the animals are always like a step behind the plants. Because the animals can't, make those changes if the plants haven't changed,
Yeah.
So for example, these dogs were good ambush hunters because they evolved in closed habitats with lots of trees to hide behind. When the trees went away and the grasslands opened up, prey animals like horses got better at just running really efficiently in a straight line for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
If there's no trees that you have to sort of weave in and out of, you can just run in a straight line.
Right.
And the predators had to adapt to that or go extinct. And in the case of those stocky dogs called the Borophagine dogs, they decreased in diversity from the middle of the Miocene to going extinct a little bit after the Miocene. Meanwhile, the canines, like wolves and African painted dogs, which are really good at persistence hunting in these open environments, did better for it. Speaking of horses, horses were a big part of my master's thesis.
Right.
I'm a little bit of a horse girl when it comes to fossils. They also had a pretty significant turnover in diversity at this time because the food that they had evolved for millions of years to eat was changing from leaves to grasses, which are much, much harder to eat because something I didn't mention about grasses earlier, they grow little shards of glass inside their leaves.
Yeah.
And if you're eating grass all day, every day, that will destroy your teeth.
Right.
The leaf eaters kind of went extinct, and those with taller teeth that could afford to get worn down over their life did a little better.
Right.
And this was true for basically every group of herbivores across the world. Things like bovids, which are your cows and sheep and antelopes, rhinos, deer, elephants. This happened with all these different groups.
Nice.
Rodents, especially mice and rats, also really exploded in diversity here because they had a lot of just new environments to exploit. In fact, despite rodents being one of the earliest groups of mammals to show up in the fossil record, the mouse and rat family doesn't evolve until the Miocene. So, like, if you go back 30 million years, there are no mice. Weird.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that look like mice, but they were not true mice or rats. And before we made nice, convenient houses, we humans made houses for them to invade. Mice and rats love fields of grass that came with the Miocene because grains, especially things like wheat, have lots of little seeds that are really easily edible by mice, and it's also relatively easy for them to hide from things like hawks in tall grass.
Yeah.
Along with mice doing really well, the things that mostly eat mice also did quite well, namely snakes. For example, the two main groups of venomous snakes show up in North America for the first time in the Miocene. Vipers, which are things like your rattlesnakes, cottonmouths, copperheads, as well as the elapids, like coral snakes. But this group also includes things like a lot of sea snakes, but also like mambas and cobras. Those didn't get to North America, but coral snakes did. And those show up in North America for the first time in the Miocene.
Yeah.
The largest group of snakes, though, are the colubrids. These are basically any kind of snake that's not a viper, an elapid, a python, or a boa. So this is things like your garter snake, hognose snake, ribbon snakes, rat snakes, water snakes, milk snakes, bull snakes, corn snakes. Anything that is like generic snake is in this group.
Okay.
With the exception of like the really small ones like garter snakes, or the ones that live mostly in water, like water snakes, nearly all snakes eat small mammals like mice as like the bulk of their diet.
Okay, so
there are obviously some exceptions. Yeah. But for example, some like pit vipers or a lot of pythons even have like heat sensing pits on their face that basically give them heat vision, or like heat sensing vision. They don't shoot heat out of their eyes like Superman. But yeah, it basically allows them to track warm-blooded prey. And so while they'll for sure eat like a lizard or a frog if they get the chance, they wouldn't have evolved these heat-sensing organs to eat cold-blooded prey, So with this boom in diversity of rodents also came snakes. And so snakes being as diverse as they are today happened because of this too.
Right.
And then lastly, a couple last things to end on, especially because Fia is my only other co-host here. I couldn't not talk about the oceans a little bit.
Hooray!
Unfortunately, especially when it comes to the invertebrate stuff, it's like 95% the same as today.
Yeah.
Whales were around and doing great. This time was their peak in diversity. Yeah, so whales, this was sort of their high times.
Go whales.
Yeah. Modern pinnipeds, so this is like seals and sea lions. They had like sort of just become like fully or like mostly aquatic, like they are today at the start of the Miocene, and they continued to diversify throughout. Kelp forests, which are extremely productive environments today. They're one of the most like biologically productive environments in the world. They sort of, I'm sure they were around here and there, but this is really when they become widespread, especially on like the west coast of the United States in North America. You kind of can't talk about the Miocene without it mentioning, at least once, one of the most famous extinct animals of all time, which for context is for sure extinct. A giant shark called Otodus megalodon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Megalodon was around for pretty much all of the Miocene, went extinct by the end of the Miocene.
No.
Functionally, a giant great white shark.
Yeah.
Not very closely related, but functionally, yeah. One of the largest fishes ever. It basically ate all those whales that were doing great.
Yeah.
And then lastly, one of my favorites in the ocean, which I just think is cooler than Megalodon, frankly, was a giant predatory species of whale. It was basically like a sperm whale that ate other whales. It's called Leviathan melvilli. So it's named after Leviathan, like from the Bible, like the giant sea monster in the Bible, and after Herman Melville, the author who wrote Moby Dick.
Oh, cool.
And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on before we sort of close, apes. We haven't really mentioned primates at all in this episode, and that's because largely the non-ape ones were fairly similar to the ones we have today. Obviously, species were different, but, like, by and large, they were the same. The apes, though, at the beginning of the Miocene, the first apes split off from the other old world monkeys, things like baboons, stuff like that. And they spread all over Europe, Asia, and Africa. So apes were not just an Africa thing. I guess there's the orangutan in Asia, but they were all over Europe, too. Somewhere around 20 to 16 million years ago or so, the great apes split off from the lesser apes, quote-unquote, the gibbons. A little bit after that, the orangutans split off. Around 12 to 8 million years ago, the gorillas split off. And then around 8 to 5 million years ago or so, the group that includes chimps and bonobos split off from our ancestors.
Okay.
So basically all the steps that went from the first apes to the first human-like thing happened throughout the course of the Miocene.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to end us off in the Miocene, a mere 5.333 million years ago, the climate kept on cooling to the point where grasses had to evolve a new way to do photosynthesis. Grasses ruled everything, which led us to have so many darn mice and snakes everywhere, and made horses and deer and antelopes and dogs really good at running in straight lines for a long time.
Right.
All the large mammals were in weird places or looked wrong. In South America and Australia, they were each still off doing their own thing, doing their weird stuff with their weird mammals. And humans had just barely split off from all of our ape cousins. And that is where we run into the Pliocene in a future episode.
Okay. Very cool.
Well, thank you. This was a little bit of a long one, but I could talk about the Miocene forever. I like the Miocene.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Gavin. I really learned a lot, and it was super cool to hear about these grasses and all of these bland mammals that went extinct.
Yeah.
Not bland, but like generic.
Right. It's
generic.
Like in life, I'm sure they were cooler.
Yeah.
That said, Oreodonts, yeah, like dollar store mammal is definitely,
dollar store
I think, like
mammal.
one of the best descriptions I've heard of them.
Right. I like that. All right. Well, this has been episode 154 of a podcast. Oh, sorry. Let me retry that. Well, this has been episode 154 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Via, and that was Gavin. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
I miss Mike. It's too much pressure doing the intro and outro.
This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.